The day Eliza Calloway rode into Dustcreek, New Mexico on the back of a borrowed mule with nothing but a carpetbag and a letter of introduction, every man in town straightened his collar and started thinking about his future. It was the spring of 1878, and Dustcreek sat in the high desert like something God had dropped and forgotten, a loose collection of buildings pressed between Red Canyon walls and a river that barely deserved the name. The railroad had come through 2 years prior, which meant the town had money now, and money meant it had ambitions, and ambitions meant it had precisely the kind of men who thought themselves worthy of a woman like Eliza Calloway. She was 23 years old, with dark chestnut hair that caught the sunlight like polished copper, and brown eyes so steady and direct that most people looked away first. She had come from St. Louis on the train, then from the last stop by mule, because her cousin Margaret had written to say that Dustcreek needed a schoolteacher, and the position paid $40 a month and came with a small house and a wood stove. Eliza had accepted before she finished reading the letter. She had her reasons for leaving St. Louis, and those reasons were her own. The man who did not straighten his collar when she rode into town was Cole Merritt, and that was partly because he did not own a collar worth straightening, and partly because he was too busy wrestling a drunk out of the doorway of the saloon before the man fell into the street and got himself run over by the afternoon freight wagon. Cole was 31 years old, broad through the shoulders, with hands that had been roughened by years of cattle work until they looked like something carved from saddle leather. He had a jaw that had been broken once and set slightly crooked, a scar along his left forearm from a fence wire dispute he did not care to discuss, and dark eyes that people in Dustcreek had learned meant business when they went flat and still. He was the town's deputy sheriff, a position he had held for 3 years, and he did the job with a thoroughness that people respected and a quietness that made some of them uneasy. He deposited the drunk against the wall of the saloon, told him to stay there until he could walk a straight line, and turned around to find the whole street had come to a stop. Eliza Calloway had dismounted from her mule in front of the general store and was looking at a piece of paper in her hand with the concentrated expression of a woman who was accustomed to solving problems on her own. Her carpetbag sat at her feet. She glanced up, assessed the street in front of her, and her eyes landed on Cole the same way they landed on everything else, without fuss, without flutter. "Excuse me," she called across the distance. "I am looking for Creek Street." "I was told there is a schoolhouse on Creek Street." Cole pointed without hesitation. "2 blocks north, turn left at the livery stable. You will smell the horses before you see the turn." She nodded once, picked up her carpetbag and said, "Thank you," in a tone that was both polite and completely self-sufficient, as if she had already moved on in her mind. Cole watched her walk away for exactly 1 second longer than was strictly necessary, then turned back to the drunk against the saloon wall, who had helpfully fallen sideways into sleep. That was the first time. Margaret Calloway, Eliza's cousin, was the wife of the town's land surveyor, and a woman who had very specific ideas about how her cousin's life should proceed now that Eliza had arrived in Dustcreek. She had arranged a welcome supper the following Friday evening and invited, by Eliza's later count, 5 men who were all considered prime matrimonial prospects in the territory. There was Franklin Holt, who owned the bank and wore a watch chain thick enough to anchor a small boat. He was 44 and had been a widower for 2 years and was ready, he made clear within the first 10 minutes, to offer any suitable woman a life of considerable comfort. There was Dr. Amos Whitfield, 28, freshly graduated from a medical college in Philadelphia, who was setting up a practice in Dustcreek, and who had the kind of careful, deliberate manners that suggested he had been raised by people who own more than one set of good china. There was Robert Payne, 30, who ran the mercantile and had a new house built with an indoor water pump, which in 1878 in New Mexico was genuinely remarkable, and he knew it because he mentioned it 4 times. There was Silas Drummond, 26, who had made a respectable sum in the silver mines north of town and had recently purchased a ranch, and was attempting to transform himself from a miner into a gentleman rancher with varying degrees of success. And there was Harrison Webb, 32, who was the county land commissioner, well-dressed, well-read, and in possession of the easy confidence of a man who had never been told no by anyone who mattered. Eliza sat at Margaret's carefully set table and was polite to all of them. She answered their questions. She asked intelligent ones in return. She ate Margaret's roast chicken with evident appreciation and complimented the sweet potato pie twice. She did not encourage any of them in particular, which seemed to confuse the room slightly, because a woman of 23 who had traveled from St. Louis to take a teaching position in the desert was generally understood to be a woman who was looking for a husband and looking with some urgency. Eliza was not looking with urgency. Eliza, as it turned out, was not looking at all, not in the way they meant. She had come to Dustcreek to teach school, and she intended to do exactly that, and if something else happened along the way, she would decide about it when it did. She walked home from Margaret's house that night alone, having politely declined 3 separate offers of escort, and she stood on the small porch of her house and listened to the desert quiet, which was not actually quiet at all but full of crickets and wind and the distant sound of horses, and she felt something in her chest unknot in a way it had not in years. She was free here. That was the thing. She was starting over clean. The school had 12 students, ranging in age from 6 to 15, and they were a mixed, unpredictable group that included the blacksmith's twin boys, who were 8 and already terrifyingly competent at mischief, and a 15-year-old girl named Ruth whose family had come from Georgia, and who was so hungry for learning that she stayed an hour after school every day just to read. Eliza threw herself into the work with everything she had. She organized her classroom, cataloged the scant collection of books, wrote letters to a book supplier in Denver, and spent her evenings preparing lessons at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and the particular focused pleasure of a person doing work they were born for. She saw Cole Merritt on the street in those first weeks the way you see the town clock or the flagpole outside the post office. He was part of the landscape. He was always there, steady and unremarkable, doing his rounds, breaking up the occasional disagreement outside the saloon, leading the Friday evening wagon of collected drunks to the overnight cell in the sheriff's office to sleep it off before being released Saturday morning. She noticed he was always where he was needed before anyone had to ask him to be there. She noticed his boots were always clean, which seemed like a small thing but was not, in a desert town where the dust got into everything. She noticed he never raised his voice. The trouble started 6 weeks after her arrival, in the form of a boy named Danny Reese, who was 10 years old and came to school with bruises more often than was explainable by ordinary childhood clumsiness. Eliza had suspected it for 2 weeks before she was sure, and once she was sure, she did what she always did with a problem. She thought it through carefully, and then she acted. The difficulty was that Danny's father, Roy Reese, was a man of volatile temper and a specific kind of pride that made him dangerous when he felt threatened. He worked a small claim in the hills and came into town twice a week for supplies, and he was known, without anyone saying so directly, as a man whose family walked carefully around him. Eliza went to the sheriff's office on a Tuesday afternoon after school. Sheriff Tom Calloway, no relation to her cousin's husband despite the shared name, was a weathered man of 55 who had been in Dustcreek long enough to have opinions about everything and the political caution that came with a job you wanted to keep. He listened to Eliza with his hat on the desk in front of him and his expression carefully neutral. "Miss Calloway," he said when she had finished, "I understand your concern. But a man's family is his own business until someone makes a formal complaint, and the Reese boy's mother has not made any complaint." "The Reese boy's mother is afraid," Eliza said. "That may be so, but without a complaint my hands are tied." "What would it take for your hands to be untied?" The sheriff shifted uncomfortably. "A witness, a formal statement, something I can put on paper." Eliza stood up. "I see," she said. in the tone she used when she disagreed completely but had decided to seek another avenue. Cole was in the back of the office. She had registered him when she came in, sitting at a side desk cleaning his pistol with the focused, methodical attention he gave to everything. He had not spoken during the exchange. He set down the cloth and the pistol barrel as she turned to leave. "Miss Calloway," he said. She turned. "The Reese claim is on the North Road. I do my morning rounds that direction every day between 7 and 8. He said it without inflection, just stating a fact. If anything were to happen on that road that required a formal response, I would be in a position to document it. It was not much. It was also, she understood, everything he could offer within the constraints he was operating under. "Thank you, Deputy Merritt," she said. "Cole," he said, and seemed mildly surprised at himself for saying it. She met his eyes for a moment. "Thank you, Cole." She went home and wrote a very careful letter to the county seat about the situation, which she mailed the next morning. 3 weeks later, after Cole had quietly made himself visible on the North Road on the mornings Roy Reese came into town, and after Eliza had spoken privately with Danny's mother twice, and after the county representative had made an unannounced visit to the Reese claim, Roy Reese became aware that several different kinds of attention were focused on him from several different directions. The bruises on Danny Reese stopped appearing. It was not a perfect resolution. Eliza knew it was not. But Danny was safer, and she had learned something about how Cole Merritt operated, which was that he found the opening in the situation, and he moved through it quietly, and he got the thing done. Summer in Dustcreek hit like something physical. The heat pressed down from a sky that turned white at midday, and the dust got into everything regardless of how tightly you closed your windows, and the river dropped to a trickle, and tempers in the saloon ran higher because there was nothing else to do in the evenings when the heat made sleep difficult. Eliza adapted. She was from St. Louis, which had its own brand of punishing summer, and she was not a woman who wasted energy complaining about weather. She moved her morning lessons outdoors under the cottonwood trees, and she served her students water with lemon when she could get lemons from the mercantile, and she read to them on the hottest afternoons from a collection of adventure stories that kept them still enough to catch whatever breeze came down from the canyon. She started seeing Cole at the water pump near the edge of town at 7 in the morning, which was when she went for the day's water, and he made his first circuit on foot. They began to talk the way people talk when they keep meeting in the same place at the same time, in small installments, a few sentences here, a few there, building something without either of them deciding to. He told her about the cattle drive he had worked before coming to Dustcreek, the long push from Texas into Kansas that had taken 4 months and covered terrain that still showed up sometimes in his dreams. She told him about St. Louis and the river, and the noise of a city that never stopped. He told her about the 2 horses he kept at the livery stable, a buckskin mare he had owned for 7 years, and a younger gray gelding he was training, and she could tell by the way he talked about the buckskin that it was something close to love. She told him about her students, and he listened in a way that was real listening, not the polite performance of listening that she had encountered too often, but the kind where he asked follow-up questions 3 days later that proved he had been thinking about what she said. "Ruth stayed an hour and a half after school yesterday," she told him one morning, referring to the 15-year-old girl. "She is working through a history of ancient Rome, and she corrects me when I mispronounce the Latin names." Cole's mouth moved in what was almost a smile. He had what she was beginning to recognize as a very specific economy of expression, where small changes in his face carried large amounts of meaning. "What does she want to do?" "She wants to go to a proper school in Santa Fe. Her parents do not think it is necessary." "Is it necessary?" "A mind like hers is a thing that requires feeding," Eliza said. "So yes, I think it is very necessary." "Are you going to do something about it?" "I am writing letters," she said. He nodded as if that was exactly the answer he expected. Meanwhile, Margaret Calloway had not given up on her project of finding Eliza a husband from among Dustcreek's eligible population. The 5 men from the welcome supper had collectively increased their efforts through the summer, each of them finding reasons to visit the school during the day, to leave small gifts on her porch, to request the pleasure of her company at the various social events that Dustcreek produced, which were limited but enthusiastically attended. Harrison Webb was the most persistent. He was handsome in a deliberate way, and he was smart, and he knew how to talk to a woman, which meant he knew how to make a woman feel interesting without necessarily being interested in her as a person. He had asked Eliza to dinner 3 times. She had accepted twice, because she liked the food at the restaurant, and she was not opposed to pleasant company, and both evenings she had come home feeling mildly irritated without being entirely sure why. She was sure why after she thought about it. Harrison Webb looked at her the way he looked at everything, as a thing to be assessed for its value and acquired if the terms were right. Franklin Holt made her feel like a line item in a ledger. Dr. Whitfield was kind and she genuinely liked him, but there was a quality to his interest that felt like he was searching for a specific person and trying to determine whether she matched the description. Robert Payne talked about his indoor water pump so often that she began to dread the sound of his voice. Silas Drummond was the most genuinely likable of them. He was unpretentious and a little rough around the edges, still despite his efforts at gentlemanliness, and he made her laugh occasionally. But the feeling between them was warm and entirely platonic, and she thought he knew it too. She was thinking about all of this one August evening when she was sitting on her porch with a glass of cool water and watching the sky turn colors over the canyon, and Cole Merritt came down the street on his buckskin mare, finishing the evening circuit, and he saw her sitting there and he pulled the mare to a stop. "Good evening," he said. "Good evening," she said. "How is the town?" "Quiet," he said. "Mostly." He held the mare easy, not going anywhere. "You look like you are thinking hard about something." "I am thinking about something moderately complicated," she admitted. "Do you want company or solitude?" She considered this genuinely. "Company," she said, "if you have time." He dismounted and tied the mare to the porch post with the practiced ease of a man who had done the gesture 10,000 times, and he came and leaned against the porch railing because she had only one chair. The sky was doing extraordinary things with orange and rose above the canyon rim. "Harrison Webb asked me to attend the Founders' Day celebration with him," she said. Cole was quiet for a moment. "He is a well-regarded man." "I know. Has a good position, good prospects." "I know that too." "Are you going to accept?" She looked at the sky. "I do not want to," she said honestly, "but I cannot explain why in a way that would make sense to anyone." "It does not have to make sense to anyone but you." She turned and looked at him. The evening light was doing something to his face that made the crookedness of his jaw less prominent, and his eyes very dark and quiet. "Margaret would disagree with that considerably." "With respect to your cousin," Cole said, and she could tell he was choosing his words, "your cousin thinks your happiness looks like a specific set of circumstances. A house and a good income and a man with a clean reputation. Those are not bad things." "No," Eliza agreed, "they are not bad things, but they are not the same as happiness." She looked at him for a long moment. "No," she said quietly. "They are not the same thing at all." He pushed off the railing after a while and untied his horse. "Founders' Day is a Saturday," he said, not looking at her. "I am off shift on Saturdays afternoon." He did not say anything else. He mounted his horse and rode on down the street, and Eliza sat with her cool water and the color fading out of the sky and the very clear understanding that something had just been offered to her in the most indirect way she had ever encountered. She went to Founders' Day with Harrison Webb because she had not yet gathered herself to decline, and it was precisely as pleasant and precisely as hollow as she had expected. Harrison was attentive and charming, and steered her around the gathering with a proprietorial satisfaction that made her feel like a new piece of furniture he was showing to his acquaintances. Cole was there in his official capacity, standing near the edge of the celebration ground in his deputy's badge, and his hat pulled down against the afternoon sun, watching the crowd with the particular focused calm she had come to associate with him. He saw her arrive with Harrison. Something passed across his face that was gone before she could read it. She excused herself from Harrison at the lemonade stand with the intention of returning quickly, and then she found herself walking toward the edge of the gathering, toward a cottonwood tree at the far corner of the grounds, and she told herself she was only walking because she needed a moment away from the noise. Cole drifted in the same direction about 10 minutes later because it was his job to cover the perimeter, and that was what she told herself when she found herself smiling as he came to stand beside her under the cottonwood tree. "The Alvarez children are trying to steal 3 extra helpings of pie each," he said, without looking at her. "I have been pretending not to notice." "That seems like a reasonable policy," she said. "Their mother would disagree." She laughed, a real one, the kind that came from somewhere warm in the middle of her chest. He looked at her sideways and she could see the corner of his mouth. "I do not want to be Harrison Webb's companion," she said very quietly. Cole was quiet. A breeze came through the cottonwood leaves. "I want to go for a ride on Saturday afternoon," she said, "up into the canyon. I was told there is a viewpoint at the top of the north wall that looks out over the whole valley." "There is," he said. "I do not know the way." He looked at her directly then, and she looked back, and neither of them looked away first. "I know the way," he said. "I thought you might." That Saturday, she wore her sensible boots and tied her hair back and met Cole at the livery stable at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. He had saddled his buckskin mare and a steady bay horse that belonged to the liveryman and that he had cleared for her to borrow. He helped her check her stirrups without making her feel helped, which was a skill she appreciated. They rode out of town without fanfare and without anyone making particular note of it, which was fine with both of them. The canyon climb was slow and spectacular. The trail wound up through formations of red and orange rock that had been standing there since before the continent decided what shape it wanted to be, and the scrub pine grew in improbable places out of cracks in the stone, and there were ravens everywhere, riding the thermals with the effortless arrogance of creatures who know they are exactly where they are supposed to be. They talked as they rode, not continuously, which was one of the things she was learning she liked about him. He was comfortable with silence. He did not fill it the way some people did, anxiously, as if quiet were an accusation. He let it sit, and then when he spoke it meant something. "Why Dustcreek?" she asked halfway up the canyon. "You could deputy anywhere." "I came through on my way to somewhere else and I liked the look of the canyon," he said. "That was 4 years ago." "Where were you going?" "I do not remember now," he said. "Somewhere north. It stopped mattering." "What made you become a lawman before the drive? You mentioned Texas. Were you always working cattle?" 8 years on cattle," he said. "Before that miscellaneous." A pause. "I was not always on the right side of things." She waited, because she had learned that he said the important things when he was ready and not before. "I was 17 in a rough part of Texas, and I made some choices that I am not proud of," he said. "Nothing that cost anyone their life, but close enough that it stays with me. When I was 22, I started fresh. Went straight. Worked cattle because that was honest work and it kept me too tired for poor decisions." "And the law?" she asked. "The first sheriff who hired me said I had good instincts about people, that I could read a situation before it became a problem." He looked at the rock ahead of them. "I think what he meant was that I had been in enough situations to know what they felt like from both sides." She thought about that for a while. "That seems like it would make you better at the job, not worse." "Most people do not see it that way. Most people," she said, "are working with incomplete information." He looked at her and she held his gaze, and the trail curved up through a stand of juniper, and the whole valley came into view below them as they came out onto the rim, wide and red and gold and impossibly big under the afternoon sky. She forgot what she was going to say next. They sat their horses at the canyon rim for a long time without speaking, because there was nothing to say that the view had not already said more eloquently. The river she had crossed on her way into Dustcreek glittered below like a thread of broken mirror. The town itself was a handful of pale buildings that looked, from this height, like something a child had arranged carefully in the dirt. "How did you find this?" she asked finally. "I come up here when I need to think clearly," he said. She looked at him. "What do you need to think clearly about?" The question was direct, and she meant it to be. He turned to meet her eyes, and for a moment the usual economy of his expression relaxed into something less guarded. "Right now," he said, "you." She felt her breath catch in the way that is less like a romantic story and more like something true and startling, like the first cold water after a long heat. "I am not a complicated person," she said, though the words felt insufficient to what was actually happening inside her. "No," he agreed. "You are not complicated. You are clear." He looked back at the valley. "That is harder to find." She wanted to say something, but the words arranged themselves poorly. After a moment she said, "I came to Dustcreek to start over." "So did I," he said. "Only I did it 4 years ago, and it took until now to feel like it was working." She looked at him for a long time, this man with his broken jaw and his clean boots, and his way of being exactly where he was supposed to be, and she felt something settle in her chest like an answer to a question she had been carrying without knowing she was carrying it. The trouble was that he did not press. He never pressed. He stated things plainly and then let them be. And on the ride back down through the canyon, she found herself wanting to shake him slightly, in the most affectionate way possible, because the amount of restraint he was applying to whatever was growing between them was admirable and also maddening. September arrived with a snap of cooler air that made the whole town feel like it had exhaled, and with it came a series of events that forced certain things out into the open whether they were ready or not. Harrison Webb made his interest formal. He came to the school on a Thursday afternoon after the students had gone home, and he sat across from her in the classroom with his hat in his hands, and he told her that he believed they were well suited, that he had a good house and good income, that he admired her intelligence and her spirit, and that he would very much like to court her with the intention of marriage. He was sincere. She gave him credit for that. He was not performing. He genuinely believed they were compatible, and she could see how a reasonable person looking at them from the outside might agree. "Harrison," she said carefully, "I am grateful for your regard, truly, but I do not think I am able to accept." He was quiet for a moment. "Is there someone else?" She thought about the canyon rim. She thought about 7 o'clock in the morning at the water pump. She thought about the way Cole had said, "Right now, you, without any decoration." "Not in the way you mean," she said. "But I think there might be." Harrison looked at her with the expression of a man rearranging his understanding of a situation. "Cole Merritt," he said. She did not confirm or deny it. "Eliza," he said her name with a gentleness that surprised her. "He is a good man, better than some give him credit for, but he will never believe himself good enough for you, and that will become a problem." She met Harrison's eyes steadily. "I appreciate you saying that," she said, "and I hope you will believe me when I say you deserve someone who is certain about you." He stood up, put his hat on, and left with a dignity that she respected greatly. She sat in her empty classroom for a while after he was gone, thinking about what he had said. "He will never believe himself good enough for you." The thing was, she had already seen it, the way Cole caught himself sometimes in the middle of warmth and pulled back slightly, as if he had suddenly remembered something, as if the warmth itself was a liberty he had not been granted. She was done waiting for him to figure it out on his own. The following Saturday she did not go to the water pump at 7 in the morning. She went to the livery stable at 6:30, where Cole was already there grooming his buckskin mare before his shift, because he was that kind of man, who arrived early and stayed late and did the work without being asked. He looked up when she came in. His expression shifted through several things quickly and settled on careful. "You are early," he said. "I am direct," she said. "I have been waiting for you to say something, and I have decided I am not going to wait any longer." He set down the currycomb very slowly and turned to face her fully. "Harrison Webb came to see me on Thursday," she said. "He made his intentions clear, and I declined him." "I heard," Cole said. "Small town." "He said something to me that I think is worth addressing directly." She stood in the doorway of the stable with the early morning light behind her, and she looked at him with all the steadiness she had, which was considerable. "He said that you would never believe yourself good enough for me, and I want to tell you, plainly and without any drama, that I think that is something you are doing to yourself and not something that is actually true." Cole was very still. The buckskin mare moved slightly, and he steadied her with a hand on her neck without looking away from Eliza. "You do not know everything about me," he said. "I know enough," she said. "I know that you have been honest with me about your past. I know you have done everything in your power to be a better version of yourself, and that you have succeeded in remarkable ways. I know you found the crack in the situation with Danny Reese when the sheriff could not, and I know you showed me the canyon because you wanted to show me something real. I know you are the most genuinely good man I have met in this town, and I have met a number of men who are considered its finest." His jaw tightened. "Eliza, do not," she said. "Do not tell me I am wrong about you. Tell me honestly whether you have feelings for me or not, because if you do not, then I will take myself home, and we will not speak of this again. And if you do, then I am asking you very kindly to stop protecting me from them." He crossed the distance between them in 3 steps, and she thought for a half-second that he was going to walk past her out the door. And then his hands were framing her face, rough and careful at the same time, and he kissed her in the way that a person kisses someone when they have been holding back for months and have just been given explicit permission to stop. She had her hands fisted in the front of his shirt, and she kissed him back with everything that had been building since the water pump and the canyon rim and every 7 o'clock morning in between. When they separated, he rested his forehead against hers, and she could feel him breathing. "I have felt this way since you asked me for directions to Creek Street," he said, and his voice was lower than usual. "I know," she said. "I could tell." He made a sound that was almost a laugh. "Could you? You watched me walk away for 1 full second longer than was necessary," she said. "I noticed." He did laugh then, a real one, unexpected and full, and she thought it might be the most beautiful sound she had heard in a long time. They walked out of the livery stable together into the early morning light of Dustcreek, New Mexico, and if the man at the blacksmith's forge across the street noticed them coming out together, well, it was a small town and news would travel at its usual efficient pace. Margaret heard about it by noon. She arrived at Eliza's schoolhouse during the lunch hour with an expression that was difficult to classify, somewhere between concern and the particular satisfaction of someone whose predictions have been borne out even if the predicted thing was not what they planned. "Cole Merritt," Margaret said. "Yes," Eliza said pleasantly. "Eliza, he is a deputy sheriff who came from, as far as anyone knows, somewhere in Texas with a very thin history before the cattle drives. He came from a difficult beginning," Eliza said, "as have many people in this territory, Margaret. You married a man who came to New Mexico with nothing but a surveyor's kit and ambition." Margaret opened her mouth and closed it. "He is the most honest person I have met here," Eliza said more gently. "He does not perform, he does not maneuver. He tells the truth and he does the work, and he is kind in ways that do not ask to be noticed. I would very much like to see where this leads." Margaret stayed for a cup of coffee and said things like, "I only want what is best for you, and I hope you know what you are doing, and the thing is, he has never seemed like the marrying kind." Eliza listened to all of it with genuine patience and some private amusement, and walked her cousin out with a warm embrace at the door. Cole came by the schoolhouse after his shift ended that evening. He stood at the door in his hat and said that the Founders' Day Social Committee was organizing a harvest dance for October, and he had been asked to provide a second set of hands for the security detail, which would occupy him until about 9 in the evening. But if she were interested in the last part of the dance, he would consider it a privilege to accompany her. She was fairly certain this was the most words he had strung together unprompted since she arrived in Dustcreek. "I will be there at 9 o'clock, she said. He nodded and turned to go. "Cole," she said. He turned back. "You can call on me," she said. "Properly. I have a front porch and a chair I am willing to share." Something happened to his face that she was fairly certain was happiness doing its best to look normal. "Tomorrow evening," he said. "Tomorrow evening," she said. He came the next evening and sat on the porch step because she only had the one chair and he declined to take it, and they talked for 2 hours about everything and nothing, about his horses and her students and the question of whether Dustcreek needed a second doctor, and whether the new telegraph line that was supposed to come through by winter actually would. She made coffee at one point and they sat in the blue evening air, and she thought, with a clarity that surprised her, that this was what she had been looking for without knowing she was looking for it. Not someone to rescue her, not someone to complete her. Someone to sit with in the evening and talk sense to, someone whose presence made the ordinary better. He started calling on her 3 evenings a week, and then 4, and the whole town rearranged its understanding of the situation with the typical thoroughness of a community that has very little else to talk about. There was some gossip, of the variety that suggested Eliza Calloway had confused a rough diamond for the genuine article, and most of it reached her ears via Ruth, who at 15 had perfect intelligence about everything that happened in Dustcreek, and reported it to Eliza with the directness of a trusted advisor. "Mrs. Jenkins at the dry goods says you could have done considerably better," Ruth reported one afternoon, with the tone of someone delivering information rather than an opinion. "What did you say?" Eliza asked. "I said I was not aware that considerably better than Cole Merritt existed within 100 miles, Ruth said, arranging her books with perfect composure. Eliza looked at her student for a long moment and felt something very warm in the vicinity of her heart. "Ruth," she said, "I have written to a school in Santa Fe on your behalf. I received a reply last week." Ruth went very still. "They have agreed to consider your application for the spring term," Eliza said. "I have written a recommendation that I believe is compelling. If you would like to apply, I will help you with the process." Ruth's careful composure dissolved for exactly 3 seconds, and she crossed the classroom and hugged Eliza with an intensity that nearly knocked her off her chair. And then she straightened back up and said, very formally, "Thank you, Miss Calloway." And Eliza had to look out the window for a moment so that neither of them had to address the fact that her eyes were bright. The harvest dance came on a cool October evening when the leaves on the cottonwoods had turned gold and fallen half off the trees, and the sky was the deep particular blue that came with the first cool front off the mountains. Eliza wore a dress she had not worn since St. Louis, a deep green wool that fit her well and that she had been saving for a reason she could not have named at the time, and she went to the dance with Margaret and her husband, and stood near the musicians for the first 2 hours, dancing once with Silas Drummond, who danced in the same way he approached everything, with honest effort and minimal grace, and once with Dr. Whitfield, who was better. At 9:05, Cole Merritt came in from the security detail, stopped just inside the door to remove his hat and hang it on the peg, and found her across the room. He was wearing a white shirt that was cleaner than usual and a dark jacket that she had not seen before, and he had shaved, not just his face but the back of his neck with the careful attention she had come to associate with him when he was preparing himself for something that mattered. He crossed the room without looking at anyone else. "Miss Calloway," he said. "Mr. Merritt," she said, and she could hear the music shifting into something slower. He held out his hand. It was such a simple gesture, and she watched his face as he did it, that slight bracing, that half-second of expecting to be found wanting, and she took his hand before the half-second could finish. They danced, and he was not a graceful dancer in the way that Dr. Whitfield was, but he was steady and he paid attention and he held her the right distance away, the careful proper distance of a man who was taking nothing for granted. She could feel the warmth of his hand at her waist through the wool. "You look very fine tonight," he said quietly, because he was not a man who said things like that easily, which meant it counted for more. "So do you," she said. "That jacket is new." "Ordered it from the Mercantile," he said, with a slightly pained expression. "Robert Payne showed me the water pump again while I was picking it up." She laughed against his shoulder and felt him relax incrementally. They danced twice more before the evening ended, and he walked her home in the October cold, her hand in the crook of his elbow, and at her door he held both her hands and looked at her with the expression she was learning to recognize as him saying the important thing. "I want to tell you something," he said. "All right," she said. "I have not let myself want things," he said slowly. "Real things, not for a long time. Because it seemed like the kind of wanting that was going to cost me more than I could afford." He stopped and started again. "I want this," he said. "I want you. Not because you are the school teacher and you have a good reputation or because it makes sense. Because you are the most honest person I have ever been in a room with, and when you look at me, I feel like myself in a way I cannot always manage on my own." Eliza's throat was doing something inconvenient. She held his hands tighter. "I am not polished," he said. "I know that. I know what this town thinks the difference is between me and the men you could have chosen instead, and they are not entirely wrong that there is a difference. I just do not think the difference is the one they think it is. The difference," she said, voice steady though she had to work at it, "is that every one of those men wanted a version of me that fit neatly into the life they had already planned. You are the only one who has ever wanted the actual me." He was quiet for a beat. "Yes," he said, "that is exactly it." She rose up on her toes and kissed him on the cold October porch under the stars that were thick and sharp in the high desert air, and he held her against him with the careful, absolute tenderness of someone who had learned the hard way how fragile good things are. November came in with cold and the news that the telegraph line was indeed being installed, which excited the town considerably. Ruth submitted her application to the school in Santa Fe with a letter that Eliza considered one of the finest documents she had helped produce, and they waited together for the reply with the particular tense patience of people who know that hope is a reasonable position. Cole proposed at the Canyon Viewpoint on the first Sunday of December. He had arranged it with a straightforwardness that was entirely in character. He told her he would like to take the ride again if she was willing, and she was willing, and they climbed the trail through the cold, clear air, and the canyon was winter quiet, the raven calls echoing differently in the cold, and at the rim with the valley spread out below them and their breath coming in small white clouds. He reached into his jacket pocket and produced a ring that was a simple gold band with a single small turquoise stone set in it, which he had bought from a silversmith 2 towns over who did work with both silver and gold, and the turquoise was the color of the sky. "Eliza," he said, "I would like to marry you if you will have me." He said it plainly, no performance, no dramatic kneeling, just him standing in the winter light holding a ring with the whole valley behind him, looking at her with the particular directness that had been the first thing she noticed about him, and that she had been falling toward ever since. "Yes," she said, "I will have you." He put the ring on her finger and then held her hand and looked at it, and she could see him deciding what he was allowed to feel and then deciding to feel it without reservation. He kissed her at the canyon rim with the cold wind moving through the junipers and the ravens calling somewhere below, and she thought this was one of the best moments she had ever had, and she wanted to hold onto the texture of it, the smell of the cold pine, and the scrape of his jacket against her cheek, and the warmth of his mouth in all that cold air. They were married in February of 1879 in the small Dustcreek church on a clear cold morning, when the canyon walls were bright pink in the early light. Margaret had reconciled herself with considerable grace to the situation by November, and had thrown herself into wedding planning with an energy that Eliza found both touching and occasionally overwhelming. The 5 gentlemen of the welcome supper were all invited and all attended, which was a testament to the social intelligence of small-town life, and also, perhaps, to the fact that 3 of them had already found their attention redirected elsewhere in the intervening months. Harrison Webb brought a thoughtful gift and shook Cole's hand with genuine warmth, and Dr. Whitfield had recently begun spending considerable time in the company of the pharmacist's daughter, who was a person of great wit and warmth, and Silas Drummond had gone back to mining with renewed energy, and showed up to the wedding with a genuine grin that suggested he was entirely fine. Eliza wore her green dress, the St. Louis one, because she liked it and because it was hers, and Margaret pinned flowers in her hair. Sheriff Calloway gave her away because she asked him to, not because she needed giving, but because she liked the old man and he had come around on the subject of Cole Merritt with the thoroughness of someone who has examined the evidence and changed his mind. Cole stood at the front of the church in his good jacket and the clean white shirt and his hat in his hands, and when she came down the aisle his face did something that she thought might be the most unguarded she had ever seen it, something open and full of light, and she walked toward him feeling as certain as she had ever felt about anything. The minister said the words, and they said the words back, and Cole's hands were warm around hers, and she was looking up at his crooked jaw and his dark, quiet eyes, and she thought, I chose this, and I chose correctly. And she was very glad she had said what she said in the livery stable that October morning, because she had the distinct impression he might have gone on being careful indefinitely otherwise. They settled into a life with the ease of two people who had each been living independently long enough to know their own rhythms and the intelligence to respect each other's. The house that had come with Eliza's teaching position was supplemented by the house that Cole had rented for 3 years and sold to the widow McLean, who needed it more than he did, and the two of them fixed up the schoolhouse house with additional lumber and a second room and a better stove, and a back porch that caught the afternoon shade in summer. Cole kept his horses at the livery stable and came home to dinner at 6 most evenings, and sometimes did not come home until after midnight when the saloon got difficult, and Eliza kept her school and her letters and her mornings at the water pump, though there was less urgency in the water pump walks now that the person she wanted to talk to was available at breakfast. They argued sometimes. She was direct and occasionally impatient, and she had very specific opinions about things that she was not always able to restrain from expressing. He was quiet in the way that could be its own kind of stubborn, and he had a tendency to take problems into himself and work them alone for longer than was necessary. These were real things, and they navigated them with the same quality of honesty that had built everything between them, not perfectly, but genuinely. Ruth's letter of acceptance from the Santa Fe school came in March, and Eliza did something she had not done in front of her students before. She wept. Not much, just briefly. Ruth, who was 15 and a half and about to become the first person in her family to attend a school beyond the territory, stood very straight and did not weep at all, which Eliza thought was probably the braver performance. Ruth's parents required some persuading, and the persuasion involved several conversations with Cole, who turned out to have a talent for talking to the fathers of daughters about the value of education, perhaps because he spoke to them not as an authority, but as someone who understood what opportunity looked like from the outside of it. Ruth's father ultimately agreed, with the condition that she write home every week, which she did, with letters that grew longer and more vivid with every month. Spring and then summer and then the beginning of fall, and Eliza noticed in the way that women notice, with a certainty that preceded any evidence, that she was expecting a child. She told Cole on a Tuesday evening on their back porch in the last of the September warmth, sitting with their coffee the way they had sat with things from the beginning, directly and without preamble. I believe we are going to have a child in the spring, she said. He set down his coffee cup very carefully, which was how she knew the feeling was too large for a normal response. He turned to look at her. His eyes did the thing where they went very still and very full at the same time. Are you certain? He asked. Reasonably, she said. He was quiet for a long moment, and then he said, Eliza, in a voice she had not heard before, and then he gathered her toward him with his arms around her and his face pressed against her hair, and he held her like that for a while, not saying anything else, and she put her arms around him and felt his breath slow and deepen into something that was not quite composure but was close to peace. Are you frightened? She asked, Terrified, he said honestly, and gladder than I have ever been about anything. Good, she said. That seems like the correct response. The winter was mild by high desert standards, and Eliza taught until January, when she agreed with Margaret and Dr. Whitfield that it was perhaps sensible to leave the classroom management to the substitute teacher, a competent young man named Peterson who had come from Ohio and who kept the students reasonably orderly, though without the warmth that Eliza's students were accustomed to and which they registered loudly. Cole was the kind of expectant father who asked very thoughtful questions and did not hover, because he understood that Eliza's competence was not something that required managing, but who was also very quietly present in a way that meant she never had to ask twice for anything. Their son was born on the 4th of March, 1880, which Eliza chose to find appropriately symbolic given that it was the date of presidential inaugurations. A coincidence that Cole observed made her sound very much like a schoolteacher, even in the middle of labor. He was a healthy boy with a good voice about him, as Dr. Whitfield reported with the professional satisfaction of a delivery that had gone well. Cole held his son for the first time sitting in the chair beside the bed, and Eliza watched his face do everything it had ever done when the feelings were too large for normal expression: the stillness, the fullness, and then something she had never seen before, which was a helpless, undefended joy that arrived on his face without asking permission. She loved him so much in that moment that it was almost inconvenient. They named him James, for no family reason in particular, but because it was a name that sounded solid and did not call attention to itself, and because Cole said quietly that he liked names that told you what to expect, and James was that kind of name. His middle name was Robert, which was Cole's father's name, offered and accepted with a simplicity that Eliza understood carried more than it appeared to. James Merritt was a loud infant who slept in short intervals and had opinions about the temperature of his blankets, and grew with the alarming speed of a child who has decided to take the whole project seriously. He had Cole's dark eyes and Eliza's copper and brown coloring, and before he was 3 months old, he had the entire town of Dustcreek thoroughly charmed, which he appeared to regard as his due. Cole was promoted to town marshal in the fall of 1880, when Sheriff Calloway retired to his sister's place in Albuquerque with the full dignified fanfare of a man who had earned his rest. The promotion meant more responsibility and a larger territory and a better wage, and Cole took it on with the same thorough, quiet competence he had brought to everything. Eliza went back to teaching in September when James was 6 months old, and could be left in Margaret's very willing and frankly ecstatic care during school hours. Margaret had become, in the course of the preceding year, one of Eliza's genuinely close companions, the difference between them having resolved into the affectionate difference of two people who are both right about different things. The school was growing. 3 new families had settled in Dustcreek following the railway expansion, and there were 17 students now, and Eliza wrote to the Territorial Education Board about a proper school building, because the one-room structure was beginning to feel inadequate, and she was not a woman who tolerated inadequacy when there was an argument to be made against it. The Territorial Board sent a representative in the spring of 1881 who toured the school with Eliza for 45 minutes and left with the strong impression that there was going to be a new school building in Dustcreek, whether the board funded it or not, but that it would be significantly more convenient for everyone if they funded it. The new school broke ground in June. They had their second child in August of 1882, a daughter they named Clara, who arrived with considerably less drama than James, and who appeared from her first days to be a person of organized and deliberate temperament, which Eliza thought was both restful and slightly suspicious in a way that made Cole laugh. "She is looking at everything," he said, holding Clara in the careful way he had developed with James and refined on the first evening. "She is assessing," Eliza agreed. "Takes after her mother," he said, and she was not sure whether he meant it as a warning or a compliment, and she decided it was both. James, who was 2.5, investigated his new sister with the thorough curiosity of someone encountering an unfamiliar species, and concluded that she was interesting if not presently interactive, and went back to his blocks with the equanimity of a child who has been well loved and does not feel displaced. Cole watched them from the doorway, James in the lamplight with his blocks, Eliza with Clara in the bedroom chair, and Eliza looked up from the baby and found him there, and they held each other's eyes across the evening room, and she thought, this is the thing. This precise moment is what a life is made of. There was a thing that happened in the fall of that year that was not dramatic but that mattered to her, and she thought about it for a long time afterward. She was at the Mercantile, Clara on her hip, when she overheard two men from the newer part of town talking about Cole in the way that people sometimes talked about him when they did not know his wife was nearby. One of them said something about how the marshal had a rough past and how you never quite knew with a man like that, who had come from cattle and worse. The other man was less certain and said that he had never found any cause for doubt. She stepped around the corner of the shelving and addressed them both with the pleasant directness that was by now a known quantity in Dustcreek. "Cole Merritt," she said, "has protected this town for 5 years with a thoroughness and a fairness that I would challenge you to find equaled anywhere in the territory. If you have a specific concern about his conduct, you are welcome to bring it to the town council, where it will be addressed. If you have a general suspicion about who he used to be, I would suggest that what a person does with who they were is considerably more relevant than who they were." She bought her flour and her salt, and she left, Clara regarding the Mercantile from over her shoulder with the composed interest that was becoming characteristic. Cole heard about this exchange, because small town, and he said nothing about it when she came home except to help her put away the groceries in the careful particular way he had of doing things that needed doing. "I heard you had words at the Mercantile," he said finally. "I expressed a view," she said. "I did not ask you to do that," he said, not with reproach, just stating it. "I know," she said. "I did it because it was true and because they needed to hear it." She looked at him. "You are allowed to let people defend you, Cole. You do not have to be the only person who carries your reputation." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I know I do not deserve you." She turned from the shelf to face him fully. "That," she said, with more firmness than she intended, "is the only thing I have ever heard you say that is completely untrue." He looked at her, this woman with flour on her sleeve and a sleeping baby in the other room and the absolute unqualified conviction of everything she said, and his face did the thing it still did sometimes, the half-second brace for the edge that never came, and then the release of it, the letting go. "I am working on believing it," he said. "Good," she said. "I will keep reminding you until you do." He crossed the kitchen and kissed her with the simple certainty of a man who has finally arrived somewhere and knows it, and she wrapped her arms around him and held on with the equal certainty of someone who chose him, from among every available option, and would choose him again any day she was given the choice. The years settled into the particular richness of a life built well and honestly, with the inevitable difficulties of weather and money and sickness and disagreement, and the accumulated ordinary beauty of raising children and doing meaningful work, and having someone to come home to who knew you completely and loved you anyway. Ruth wrote from Santa Fe with increasing accomplishment and eventually became a teacher herself, sending Eliza a letter of such precise and eloquent gratitude that Eliza had to put it down twice before she could read it straight through. Cole read it after her and set it on the table and said nothing for a moment, and then said, "That is a good return on a letter of recommendation," which was the way he said he was moved. Danny Reese grew up and moved north and eventually sent a brief note to the school addressed to Miss Calloway, which was addressed correctly in spirit if not in name, that said only, "I remember. Thank you." James Merritt grew up with his father's steady temperament and his mother's direct gaze, and a gift for horses that Cole fostered with the quiet intensity of someone passing on something valuable. And by the time he was 8, he could ride the buckskin mare's younger replacement, a gray who had replaced the original with the same name, with a competence that made the liveryman say he had never seen a natural like it. Clara Merritt grew into the organized, deliberate person she had appeared to be from birth, and she had her grandmother's china and her mother's stubbornness, and a gift for mathematics that sent Eliza back to her letter writing with renewed purpose, because there was a school in Albuquerque that was beginning to admit young women, and Clara Merritt was going to it if Eliza had anything to say about the matter. A third child arrived in the spring of 1886, a boy they named Henry, after no one in particular, and because it suited him, and he was from the first day a person of exuberant and somewhat exhausting good humor who treated the world as if it had been arranged for his entertainment, which Eliza thought was a quality of character she hoped he would eventually moderate, but that she found genuinely delightful in the meantime. Dustcreek grew and changed in the way that Western towns grew and changed in the 1880s, with the expansion of the railway bringing more people and more commerce and more complexity, and with the slow and imperfect resolution of the questions about land and territory that had been the source of injustice in the region for decades. Cole's job became more complicated as the town grew, and there were moments when the old violence of the West pressed up against the edges of what he could manage with quiet and presence, and he handled those moments with the same thoroughness and the same fairness and the same insistence on doing the thing right. He remained, as he had always been, a man who believed in the law not because he had always been on its side, but because he understood what happened when no one was. There was an evening in the summer of 1887 when Eliza was sitting on the back porch in the last light with coffee, Cole beside her, James and Clara somewhere inside arguing about something with the comfortable intensity of siblings who are close enough to fight, and Henry asleep already, and the canyon walls turning orange in the late sun. And she thought about the woman who had arrived on a borrowed mule 7 years before with a carpetbag and a letter of introduction and a need to start over clean. That woman was here still. She had not been replaced or smoothed over or fitted into someone else's idea of what she should be. She had simply become more fully herself, which was what happened, she thought, when you chose the right things and the right people with enough honesty and enough courage. "You are thinking again," Cole said beside her. "I'm always thinking," she said. "What this time?" She looked at the canyon, at the particular color the light made on the red rock, at the ravens riding the last thermals of the day. "I was thinking about borrowed mules," she said. He was quiet, and she felt him turn slightly toward her in the way that meant he was listening. "I was afraid coming here," she said. "I did not admit it at the time. I came because I needed to and because I am not a person who gives in to fear, but I was afraid." "Of what?" he said. "That I had built expectations I could not actually meet, that a life I had imagined was different in the execution, that I had come a very long way for nothing substantial." She turned to look at him. "I was afraid that I would get here and it would be ordinary." He met her eyes in the evening light. "Is it?" She thought about the canyon rim in the winter cold. She thought about the livery stable in the early morning. She thought about the way he looked at their children. She thought about 7 years of evenings on this porch and the thing between them that had not diminished but deepened, the way canyons deepen, by the slow, persistent work of something honest moving through them. "It is extraordinary," she said. "Entirely ordinary and entirely extraordinary." He reached over and took her hand, his thumb moving across her knuckles in the quiet, familiar way he had, and they sat together in the fading light of the canyon and said nothing else for a while because nothing else needed to be said. Later that evening, after the children were settled and the house was quiet, Cole sat at the kitchen table going through some paperwork from the county, which was a thing he did several evenings a week now with the increased administrative weight of the marshal's position. Eliza sat across from him correcting exercise books, the lamp between them, the night pressing pleasantly against the windows. She looked up from a student's composition about the history of New Mexico Territory and found him looking at her, not reading his papers, just looking, with the expression he had never quite learned to hide and had stopped trying to. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said, "just looking." She returned to the composition. Then she said, without looking up, "Cole, I love you." The simple declarative sentence, stated plainly, which was the only way she ever said the important things. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, equally plainly, equally certain, "I love you, Eliza." She smiled at her student's description of the Spanish colonial period, and thought that she had been right, all along, about all of it, and that the most useful thing she had ever done in her life, other than teaching Ruth to write that letter, was to walk into a livery stable before sunrise and say exactly what she meant. The new school building in Dustcreek was completed and opened in the fall of 1888, and it had 3 rooms and proper desks ordered from a supplier in Denver, and a library corner with 47 books, which Eliza considered a reasonable beginning. And it had a sign above the door that said Dustcreek Public School in painted letters that the town carpenter had done himself in a fit of civic pride. The day it opened, Eliza stood in the doorway of the main classroom with James on one side of her, who was 8 and a student here, and Clara on the other, who was 6 and beginning her first year, and Henry, who was 2.5 and present entirely due to the impossibility of leaving him at home, on her hip. Cole was somewhere in the crowd outside. She could see his hat above the heads of the assembled town. She had her students sit down, and she stood in front of the room and looked at their faces, all 17 of them plus the new additions that the fall had brought, 21 children in total, looking back at her with the particular mixture of curiosity and wariness that children brought to the first day. She said what she always said on the first day. "The only thing I will ask of every person in this room is that you bring your full attention. I will do the same. Everything else follows from that." And then she began. After the day ended and the children had gone home, and the new building sat in the late afternoon quiet of its first day completed, Cole came to find her in the classroom, which he knew she would still be in, rearranging something or making a list or doing the 10 small things that a teacher does at the end of a day to prepare for the next one. He stood in the doorway and she looked up from the desk. "Good day," he said. "Very good," she said. 21 students. 2 of them can already read above their age. One of them will be troubled by October. Which one? The Hartley boy. He has the look, like he is always deciding whether the rules apply to him," she said. "He will be fine. He is smart. He just needs to be convinced that the rules are interesting." "You will manage it," Cole said. "Of course," she agreed pleasantly. He came in and leaned against the door frame with his hat in his hands, and she came around the desk to stand in front of him, and he looked at her for a moment with all of it visible, the years and the life they had made and the 4-year stretch before she arrived when Dustcreek had been a place to be and not yet a home. "I have been thinking," he said. "You are always thinking," she said, turning his line back to him. "About what Harrison Webb said." She looked at him. "What about it?" "He said I would never believe I was good enough for you," Cole said, "and I told you I was working on it." He paused. "I wanted you to know that I have stopped working on it." She waited, not sure of the direction. "Not because I gave up," he said, "because I think it is the wrong question." He looked at her with the directness that had been the first thing she noticed about him, and that had not changed. "The question is not whether I deserve you. The question is whether I am worthy of the life we are building together. And the answer to that one I can control." She felt the thing in her chest that had no name exactly, the compound thing that was love and admiration and the particular joy of being known by someone. "Cole Merritt," she said, "that is the most eloquent thing you have ever said to me." "I have been practicing it," he admitted. She laughed, a real one, and she put her hands against his chest and looked up at him, and he put his arms around her in the empty schoolroom with the afternoon light coming through the new windows. "You have always been worthy of it," she said. I knew it in the livery stable. I knew it at the canyon rim. I knew it the day you helped Danny Reese without anyone asking you to. You have always been worthy of it, and I am very glad I said so before you had the chance to decide otherwise." He held her in the empty schoolroom, and outside the windows the canyon walls were turning the particular gold of a late autumn afternoon in New Mexico, 1888, 10 years after a woman had arrived on a borrowed mule with a carpetbag and a letter of introduction and the honest intention of starting over clean. She had done that, and better. She had built something. They had built something, the two of them together, steadily and without pretense, out of early mornings and evening porches and canyon viewpoints, and the honest language of people who say what they mean. The Hartley boy was indeed trouble by October, but manageable trouble, the kind that resolved into something useful once the right book was put in front of him, which in his case turned out to be a history of explorers that kept him occupied so thoroughly that he forgot to be disruptive for weeks at a time. Clara was accepted to the school in Albuquerque at 14, which was earlier than expected, and which required a significant letter-writing campaign, and one in-person visit by Eliza, that the school director later described to his colleagues as the most organized advocacy he had encountered in 20 years of education. Clara went to Albuquerque with a trunk of sensible clothes and her mother's directness, and came back 3 years later with a certificate and a burning interest in civil law that surprised no one who had known her as an infant. James became what everyone who had watched him as a boy had always suspected he would become, a man who worked with horses professionally, training them for various operations throughout the territory, with a patience and skill that Cole watched with a pride so large and quiet it was almost indistinguishable from the way he stood in any given moment, except that Eliza always knew. Henry grew into his exuberant humor and channeled it eventually into medicine, becoming the kind of doctor who laughed easily with patients and was devastating at a card table and who never forgot a name, and who came back to Dustcreek after his training to practice, alongside Dr. Whitfield's successor, which brought him home, which was something Eliza held in her heart as one of the better gifts a life could give. Dustcreek continued its transformation through the late 1880s and into the 1890s, the territory moving toward statehood with the complicated and often painful negotiation that such things required, and the questions of land rights and the treatment of the people who had been in this territory longest were argued about with varying degrees of honesty and justice in the surrounding territory. Cole made it his policy to run his marshal's office on the principle that the law applied equally, which was not a universally popular position, and which he held anyway with the stubbornness of a man who had thought it through carefully. On the evening of their 20th anniversary, in February of 1899, the children grown, the house quieter but full still of the accumulated warmth of everything that had happened in it, Cole and Eliza rode up to the canyon rim. They had done it every year, or nearly every year, when the winter permitted it, on one of the days near the anniversary, because it was their place and had been since the beginning. They sat their horses at the edge in the winter light, both of them older now, Eliza with some gray coming into her chestnut hair that she wore simply and well, Cole with more lines at the corners of his eyes and the jaw still crooked, and the hands still rough and the dark eyes still with that quality of looking at things directly. The valley spread below them in the winter clarity, the town larger now, more buildings, more people, the river catching the light the same as it always had. 20 years, she said. 20 years, he agreed. She looked at the valley and then at him. Are you glad you stopped being careful? She asked. He looked back at her, this woman who had walked into a livery stable at 6:30 in the morning and told him that she was done waiting, and he thought about the shape of his life before that morning and after it, and the difference between the two was so large it was like standing on the rim and looking at the size of the canyon. Every day, he said. She smiled at him, the same smile she had at 23 and the same at 43, the one that came from somewhere real and had never been for show. He held out his hand, the way he had at the harvest dance 20 years before, the same gesture, and she took it the same way, without hesitation. They rode back down through the canyon in the winter light, back to the town that was theirs, and the house that was theirs, and the life they had made together with nothing but honesty and courage and the willingness to say the true thing out loud and let it land where it would. The ravens rode the thermals above the canyon walls, the same as they always had, indifferent and magnificent. The river ran below. The sky was the color of the ring on her finger, blue and clear and enormous. And in Dustcreek, New Mexico, in the last year of the 19th century, Cole and Eliza Merritt came down from the canyon together, as they had always been, as they always would be, in all the years that remained to them, which were many and full, and entirely their own.